considered to be the liberation from the tyrants and big men who had emerged in the post-independence years. Okay, so that context was very important. There was a lot of push from civil society, from universities, okay, internally from populations in many countries, and in fact, quite some change was achieved during the 1990s. Okay, quite some change was achieved during the 1990s, positive change. And I think because of that positive change during the 1990s, this laid a good foundation for the growth that was experienced by many African states in the new century. Okay, so institutions have a very important role. You could say the 20 lost years were probably also the years of the worst institutional abuses that we had in post-independence history. So there's a close link between institutional development and economic development in African states. Okay. So I could say then this in turn gave way to the third generation of development thought. But what's important is that in the initial phase of institutional development and political transitions in Africa during the 1990s, the processes, unfortunately, in many of the states were not deeply rooted. They were mainly elite-driven, cosmetic processes that did not kind of resisted fundamental change. So in Kenya, for example, we had a very long process that began of constitutional development that began in the 1990s and only ended in 2010. Okay, and part of the reason was that initially in the 90s the process was very elite-driven, but after that, then a process based on broader participation emerged. So I could say initially there was many African states and leaders during the 90s were in love with the forms of democracy, like multipartyism, but not the substance. Okay, so for the substance to take root, actually took quite a while. So the big question then, and I more or less finished my introduction on this, is the third phase, where we're talking about a new hope. And this is why we're talking about ability of business schools as well to influence institutions, okay, because we operate in an institutional context. Okay, so we've had very encouraging statistics emerging over the last 3-4 years about Africa. Firstly, that it's the fastest growing emerging market. Okay, I told you that 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the last 10 years have actually been African countries. But we know in economics that growth does not necessarily mean development. You can have growth without development. So is this growth translated into an improvement in the quality of life in African states? Okay, so that's the big question that we have there. I think one of the very positive indicators, and I think something business has been very excited about, is the fact that we have a fast-growing middle class in many African countries. And the fact that, according to the World Bank, about 60 million Africans now have incomes of $3,000 per capita and above, and we expect about 100 million, almost double, to have those kind of incomes by 2015. So probably that's one of the biggest reasons for excitement about Africa, because if you look at the transitions in India, for example, and China, one of the major aspects of transition in India and China was the fact that from the 1970s you started seeing a fast-growing middle class in both of these countries. Okay, so just to show you just a few statistics, and then I conclude on this about basically the new hope that has emerged since the turn of the century. You can see there from the statistics that I gave you there that actually there's a clear correlation between share of African countries that have been improving their business environment and growth. So you can see countries that have been reforming and improving their business environments have in fact done much better than the countries that haven't been improving their business environment. And obviously this goes for political institutions as well. Countries that have achieved more solid political reform and deep-rooted reform have actually done much better in terms of economic performance. You can see from that map there that many of the countries in Africa now, sub-Saharan Africa in green, meaning that you have democracies of one type or another. You still have authoritarian regimes in a few countries, but you can see authoritarian regimes are kind of a minority in many of the countries, unlike the situation that you had probably at the beginning of the 1990s, late 1980s. And those statistics there, some statistics there I'm also giving you that show that actually political and civil liberties in many African countries have improved, even in relation to global comparisons. You could see that at the beginning of the 1970s, the period of the first generation, more or less, less than 10%, about 6% of African countries only could be considered as free. This number has gone up quite substantially now, okay, to about 20%. And about 50% of African countries could be considered politically at least as partially free. Then we've had successes also in education, primary school enrollment going up to almost 80%. Secondary school enrollment is still low in relation to other developing countries, but there have been slow improvements, especially since the turn of the century. There have been considerable decline in child mortality rates. Still some shocking statistics there for individual countries, okay, in terms of mortality rates, but generally an improvement. Maternal mortality rates also gone down. One of the biggest successes, of course, we've had that we all know about is mobile phone internet penetration. That's been one of the big success stories that we've had in the last 15 or so years. But many challenges remain. Many challenges remain. And I think this is going to be developed further by some of the other speakers. But in many African states, we still have a problem of extractive institutions where policies and practices still benefit a small group of people. So you have a lot of inequality. I think several of the speakers before me have talked about the inequality that you have in many of the African states. Our capital formation in African countries is still very low compared to other parts of the developing world. Okay? If you do a comparison, you still find our capital formation is still at about 15%, which is still very low compared to many other developing countries. And I'll end on the note that despite progress in a number of areas, probably one of the biggest challenge we still have in many African countries is regulatory barriers. Regulatory barriers are still very pervasive in African states, and you can see that compared to other parts of the developing world, where if, for example, you look at East Asia, where the average ease of business ranking is about 83, the average ease of business ranking of African countries is still 139. So we still have a lot of challenges in terms of regulatory barriers in many African states. Okay, and you could say only of 185 countries in this index, only one sub-Saharan African country falls in the top 20. That's Mauritius, and you have several that actually fall in the top 50. Okay, there's 7 that fall in the top 100. So there's still a lot of challenges for doing business, and I think as business schools, this is probably one of the areas that we can really push for. Okay, you can see typical constraints that face private sector firms in many African countries include electricity, finance, informal practices, political stability, corruption, crime, and so on. This will be developed further by the other speakers. So my objective was just to give you a context in which to see institutional development and economic development in Africa since the post-independence period, and now further development of this will be done by the other speakers. So it's my great pleasure to now welcome Professor Terry Ryan to make the first presentation on abusive institutions. Professor Terry Ryan is the chairman of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics in Kenya at the moment, very central institution in Kenya, in the planning process in Kenya. He's also been an economic secretary in the Ministry of Finance, has a long period of time as well that he's worked for the academia in Kenya, taught for many years at the University of Nairobi, and also has been involved in public policy in many different capacities and research, having carried out consultancy and research for many institutions over the years, including the World Bank, UNDP, and many others, and also obtained his PhD in economics from the prestigious MIT. Most welcome, Professor Terry Ryan.
Thank you very much, Robert. Right, can you switch this thing off? Right. Right, we're obviously running very short of time, and Robert has said much of the things which I would have wished to say, but I want to put it in a somewhat different context. Had we been studying back in the 60s, 50s, we would have been reading Walter Rodney and Underdevelopment and all that sort of stuff. Had we been studying in the 60s and 70s, we would have been reading Steve Langdon and the transnational corporations and all that kind of stuff. Had we been reading in the 80s, we would have been reading Anne Kruger and the Rent-Seeking Society and all that kind of stuff. Right. Now, and of course, a ghost behind all this thing running through is the Bretton Woods institutions coming into operation in the beginning of the 60s. Right, we were there, they were there before, but now all these are institutions. I want to just make it very, 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 very clear that these are institutions which are extremely efficient, and they're doing exactly what they want. You might not like it, but they're successful in doing what they want. Institutions always have an agenda. Well, actually they don't. The people who run the institutions have an agenda. And you folk have all come across boardroom takeovers. What's a boardroom takeover? It's nothing other than an election. So there are endless institutional captures. And why do you capture an institution? For the very simple reason that you want your agenda to be the operative agenda. I really get distressed when people talk about the efficiency of it. You know, this is an inefficient institution. What they really mean is this institution doesn't produce what I want. It may be producing exactly what the person who's running it wants. So it's a highly efficient institution. Institution, they all have an agenda. And it's that fact which makes it terrifically difficult to talk about my topic. My topic is the abuse of institutions. It is to say that an institution which is highly efficient doing something you really don't like at all can be abused to deliver what you want. Believe me? Right. I had the privilege to go against the Commonwealth Secretariat at some stage, saying that the best way of introducing reform is by stealth. The place nearly came down. Now why? Because if you creep up on if you want to do a reform and you've got an institution which is delivering something that you really don't like, then for goodness sake don't tell people that you're about to reform it. Because if you're going to tell them, the first thing you will have is a lobby there, and the lobbies all have power. They have access. Those of you, well, those of us, who've sat around in African political fora realize that access is what counts. do you have the private line to the minister or whoever? Yes, you do, right? You're important. If you don't, well, you've got to go through the secretary and then you've got to pay and blah, 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 blah. Right, no, so what I wanted to get across, therefore, is this business of reform by stealth is to anticipate a lobby. Don't tell people you're about to take their privilege away. Because as this is quite correct, the income distributions in Africa, the Gini coefficients are all bad. Tanzania's got probably the best, Botswana's not too bad, but the rest are pretty poor. So what you've got to do, therefore, is to be aware that we have the classical asymmetry. The people who are going to gain in a reform don't know what they're going to gain. They're unorganized. They're unable to put together a platform to come forward and campaign. Whereas the people who are about to lose in the course of a reform are only too well aware. So transparency is not quite as attractive as we are told. Accountability? Oh, I'm completely accountable. I'm a monopolist, and I really have this magnificent monopoly, and I make money by the by the handfuls. And I am absolutely transparent. You want to see, I do everything by the book. You can go and examine it all. I'm fully accountable for everything, and I like my monopoly, and I'll keep my monopoly. Why do I keep my monopoly? Because I don't have an institution which will ensure competition. Now, this is one of the key things in African political transformations, that many of us think we're going to do it all at once. We don't do it. It doesn't work that way. You need to introduce parallel institutions. You're going to remove price controls. Fine, I'm going to remove price controls. Have I got an anti-monopoly regulation? Have I got legislation there which will protect me if people start exploiting this thing? Because nothing is more certain than if I take price controls away, I'm immediately going to have an inflationary effect. We all have suppressed inflation if you have. Or if you're going to, this is one I really like, as Robert mentioned, one of these phases that we were talking about is the parastatal phase. Now, it is absolutely sensible. It's a very sensible thing. You've just got political independence, so get economic sovereignty as well. So if you're going to get economic sovereignty, the probability is that you're going to have to put up parastatals to sort of fill in the gap. And if you read the legislation country by country, you'll find that these are temporary things. They're merely going to be there until such time as the citizens can come up and take them over. Ha, 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 ha. Right? We've all sat in that one as well. So, parastatals they can be efficient in the sense that they deliver an agenda. So I have put my brother-in-law in as the chairman of this parastatal, better than chairman, CEO of this parastatal, and I expect him to do the necessary and oblige. And he will do it, and I'm very happy, he's very happy, and nobody else is very happy. So these are not abuses of institutions. This is people capturing an institution and introducing a new agenda. For an abuse of an institution, in fact, what you have to do is you have to take the agenda and distort it somehow. Now, Joe Stiglitz, Joe Stiglitz actually wrote his Nobel Prize study here in Nairobi. Many are unaware of that, but it actually was produced in the Institute of Development Studies. And so the asymmetric information, the classic principal agent theory. Now, so we have principals who are CEOs, and they are very clear about what they want to do with their institution. And the next thing is that downstream, the person who is meant to be actually putting this thing into operation is still stuck with the old mentality. It's what's known as institutional inertia. To give a good Kenyan example, I remember when we took a whole lot of controls off, and we abolished a whole lot of things. We said, right now, all we've got, so we told everybody, now you're facilitators. You're not regulators, facilitators. They said, right, good. And the next thing, I had somebody in the office saying, I went in there to get facilitated, and I was told, could you fill in these forms, please? And we were back where we started. In other words, classical asymmetry, this problem, well, classical asymmetry is actually something quite different, but this principal agent problem, the best way of seeing this thing is you break a traffic rule and you get sold the property right by paying a bribe, right? So you bought the property right of speeding or crossing the white line or doing whatever by paying a bribe. That's in simple economics, it's a marginal cost, right? And you get all sorts of similar things. You lose a file, you pay a facilitation fee to find the file, etc. Now these are all abuses. But then you get the other guy who's at the top of the thing, and he's at the top of the pile, and he has the power, due to the way in which the legislation designs his institution, to contract to buy battleships, airplanes, build hydroelectric schemes, all those sort of things, right? So he can then produce airplanes, hydroelectric schemes, but they're going to be wrongly priced. This is grand corruption. Now, grand corruption, of course, is not a marginal cost. It just merely shifts your total cost structure up, and so all the prices go up with this thing. Now, this is an abuse. These are classic abuses of institutions, both grand corruption and petty corruption, as distinguished here. Now, these are corruptions. In other words, here is somebody actually using an institution for their own personal benefit or for their community's personal benefit. We're all aware that the dictionary definitions of corruption is the use of public office for private gain, and we think that that actually is what it is, but it's here we have a different problem. Because I have been educated by immense sacrifices by my community. And I am now in the privileged position to be able to give jobs to some people. And I give them to the members of my community who made the sacrifices to get me where I am. Is that corruption? Yes, it is corruption. Is it immoral? More difficult to say, because the people may be very good people. Now, having said all of that, I'm trying to put this thing very briefly because our time is against us. So, there are only 3 policies in macroeconomics. There are only 3. And you cannot afford to ignore any one of them for a long time. You can get away with ignoring one or two from time to time, but not all three all the time. Growth, equity, and sustainability. If you don't hit all these bases, I got a nice quote from you, which exactly says this. Yes, and it's what it says is, so if you don't grow, the cake is not going to get bigger, and therefore the slices, no matter how equitable they are going to get smaller and smaller, and you're going to get egg in your face in the end. It'll blow up. If you only have growth and you don't have equity, and then the poor get poorer, you're going to get egg in your face and it's still going to blow up. And if I'm really one of these extremely good guys, and I'm worried about the environment, and I'm really, bending over backwards to ensure that the next generation gets the resources that it should get, etc., etc., but I don't concentrate on what's going on in the present, then I've got my head stuck in the clouds, along with all those other things that they store in the clouds these days, right? So, not a good idea. You have to keep all three pieces going. You can afford to leave one from time to time. So, what does the abuse of institutions do? Well, the abuse of institutions shifts you into a lower return world. You can grow and you can get along. This is a digression, but you'll allow me a digression. You put up with me so far, so you may as well put up with me. Unilever, Tiny Rollins. When the late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta took power, Unilever has had a business here in Kenya, and immediately the local director was the Mzee's son-in-law. Immediately. Access instantaneous. Mzee Kenyatta dies, and Daniel Arap Moi takes power. Within a week, the position is given to Daniel Arap Moi's nephew. This is what I mean by an abuse of power. This is what corruption, what it means if you don't keep your eyes on the three things: growth, equity, and sustainability. Robert gave us a couple of very simple statistics there, but I want to just stick in one more statistic, and then I'm going to stand down. I can only really talk of Kenya statistics with authority, but the formal sector accounts for between 8 and 10% of the total population. So if we are busily producing people out of business schools for that 8%, where are we going?
Thank you, Prof. Ryan, for that very insightful presentation. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robin Chibuka, to do a presentation on private sector advocacy, the role of private sector foundation in Uganda, and Professor Chibuka is the board chairman of Standard Bank in Uganda. He has more than 20 years of experience working at the IMF, including at executive board level, and has some experience in the academia as well, having taught at Harvard and also at Makerere. And so we're sure he'll give us some very insightful ideas. Most welcome, Dr. Robin Chibuka.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your kind introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think Robert has given us a very useful framework to look at economic development in Africa. My presentation is going to focus on the third phase of development by focusing on a particular institution which has been adopted in Uganda to try to help or to assist economic development. And I think, as you see, there is a role for business schools to play to assist this type of institutional development in furthering economic development. So I'm going to be talking about the private sector advocacy, specifically the role of the private sector foundation in Uganda. I also happen to be a member of the advisory committee for the private sector foundation in Uganda. So the private sector foundation in Uganda has played a role as a forum for private sector activities in Uganda. It initiates policies that support this sector, and it reviews government policies. In particular, it has been reviewing budgets, the annual budgets, and also economic development plans. It has also undertaken research, typically in conjunction with the government and donors in Uganda, to initiate new policies or refine existing policies. It also promotes public-private partnerships, and it has provided capacity building to the membership. Now, the background here is the private sector in Uganda is still quite small relative to GDP, because I think the majority of contributors to GDP are large corporations. So private sector is still quite small, and also in the scale of operations. So the sector is clearly dominated by small to medium enterprises, which have very limited resources and expertise. And thus, there is a dearth of own or other research within the economy to challenge government policy. And there is limited infrastructure, which implies that you have very high costs of starting business, you have very high risks, and so in a nutshell, I think it's very important that there should be some advocacy for the private sector. There is a huge premium if you can have a successful advocacy for the private sector. Now, the history is that PSFU was founded in 1995, clearly as we're approaching the third phase of what Robert was talking about. And it's the apex body for private sector advocacy in Uganda. It comprises 175 associations, corporations, and major public sector agencies. In fact, there are three types of membership. One is for corporations, one is for the associations, but they also decided to incorporate the public sectors which focus on private sector activities. So they can also be members of the private sector foundation to contribute to the advocacy role. Governance of the private sector foundation. There are 16 directors elected according to membership categories. And so there are those 6 committees. I don't think I will mention all of them, but you can see clearly that they've demarcated different areas for these committees to play a role in creating advocacy for the private sector. The vision: to be the national lead partner in private sector development. And the mission is to strengthen private sector capacity for effective policy advocacy and market competitiveness. And the mandate is quite broad. It carries out policy research and advocacy on behalf of the private sector, provide a forum for discussion on policy issues, and it maintains a dialogue with the government on behalf of the private sector, and undertakes capacity building for the membership, including associations. Now, capacity building entails training, and this could be association governance, financial management, accountability, budget and policy analysis. It organizes various programs like mentorship, networking, internship placements, business guidance and counseling, and institutional support of member associations. And it holds annual events, for example, trade fairs and other activities to promote private sector activities. PSFU has been conducting a financial literacy program, and it's undertaking this in conjunction with one of the local banks, Centenary Bank, as well as the Agribusiness Initiative Trust in Uganda. And it also assists individuals and business enterprises in agricultural value chains. The impact of this training program has affected directly about 4,000 people and about 4 million people indirectly. And it's why so many people, 400? Because part of it is through radio programs or discussions in newspapers and various forums. So on average, they have carried out surveys, and they estimate that it has impacted indirectly up to 4 million people in the country. Now, phase 1, which was in 2011, covered 5 districts with a total of about 1,200 business enterprises. Phase 2, which was in 2012, covered 20 districts and about 2,400 small to medium enterprises. The PSFU has built a very strong partnership with key policymakers and has assisted with the formulation and articulation of broad private sector positions as input in policy issues. It has impacted domestic policies. Perhaps I should not go in details on some of these issues since you can see them on the screens. And it has had a number of outputs, which include position papers, policy briefings, and also the annual major policy platform for action. This is an active program which is developed with interaction with various stakeholders, and every year it's updated. and it provides a work program through which the PSFU interacts with the various policymakers. And other outputs are outlined below as background papers, for example, to the Presidential Economic Council. What have been the channels for domestic policy reforms? Some of these are the presidents, the Office of the President, and the President Economic Council. The PSFU has been providing direct inputs in activities at the level of the President. It has also interacted with the Office of the Prime Minister, and most critical, and I think this is where we have the largest input, through the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. In fact, typically twice a year, the Minister of Finance meets with the Private Sector Foundation, initially to get inputs to go into the national budget. And after the budget has been presented, there is a tradition where the minister will be hosted at a luncheon where we then discuss what has been accomplished in the budget for that particular year. The PSFU also interacts with the parliamentary committees, which, as you know, are very critical in formulating legislation in Parliament. And it also acts through the sector-wide working groups in the ministries and other government agencies. These are very critical because these are the organs where a lot of policies are developed and articulated. So the Private Sector Foundation plays a very critical role at this junction. So what have been the notable outcomes? There has been on average an acceptance of about 78% of private sector proposals in the national budget. There has been a substantial enhancement of resource allocation to infrastructure. As I indicated earlier, with very limited infrastructure, it's very difficult for these small enterprises to operate businesses. If you don't have a road, if you don't have electricity, if you don't have water, it becomes very, very difficult to set up a business or to maintain one. So because of pressure from the Private Sector Foundation in Uganda, the government has now allocated considerably much more resources to develop the infrastructure, in particular roads and the energy sector. The PSFU was also very instrumental in establishing agricultural finance facility, which is helping the agricultural sector to get funding to continue with its development. It has also been very instrumental in passing a number of acts of Parliament. I'm not going to read them. I think you can see them there at the bottom of the slide. I think this chart is quite useful. It shows you the trend in the acceptance of government of recommendation by the PSFU on the budget. And as you can see, there has been a trend of improvement up to about close to 80% acceptance of recommendations by the PFSU into the budget. I think there has been a learning process, and I think as the dialogue has improved, government has started to take the Private Sector Foundation much more seriously, to the point where it impacts almost 80% of the inputs from the sector. Okay, the PSFU has not only impacted domestic policies, it has impacted policies at the regional level. And this is very important within East Africa, because as you know, Uganda is part of the East African community. And there are a lot of policies which are being articulated on a regional basis and which has enormous impact on the activities of the private sector in the country. And the channels for these policy reforms include senior government officials within Uganda, the East African community itself, and the East African Business Council, as well as COMESA. And some notable outcomes in this regard have been a framework for single customs territory negotiations, which have reduced costs, clearing costs at the port by about 30%. So that has had a major impact on the operation costs of the private sector. There has also been a reduction in non-tariff barriers. There has also been an improvement in the standardization procedures within the East African community. And this has contributed significantly to the Uganda's products to move around within the East African community. The PSFU has also encouraged government to set up various partnerships. And this includes Business Uganda development schemes. There have been various schemes, for example, the Energy for Rural Transformation, where the role of the PSU has been to act on the private component of that project to assist with the availability of electricity in the rural sectors, which then has a major impact on the business operations within the rural area. There has also been DFID, the Department for International Development, has a 5-year project in Uganda, and it has partnered with the PSFU to carry out the private sector component of that project. And that project is targeted mainly to the northern part of the country, which had been devastated by a lot of activities, conflicts in the region. There is also another project, the BADS, Agricultural Livelihood Recovery Program. This is funded by the EU, and again, they partnered with the private sector foundation to implement that particular project, which has been targeting mainly the agriculture sector. So in conclusion, I think the PSFU has filled a void in Uganda to try to advocate for the private sector, and I think has had a significant impact in influencing government policies to the benefit of the private sector. It has developed active and effective networks with the government and within the region. It has also promoted very actively the public-private partnerships in the region. Now, this is only, I think, a first phase. It has been quite successful, but I think there is a lot more to be done, as Robert pointed out earlier. There are many challenges facing the country, but I think what we see here is an experimentation, if you will, an innovation, where a new institution has emerged to fill a void, and I think has significantly contributed to the third phase of economic development in Africa, where we see acceleration in economic development. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robin Chibuka, for that very insightful presentation on the role of the private sector foundation in Uganda. It's amazing what private sector advocacy can achieve sometimes, and this is a very good case study. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Africa Arinyo, who is a visiting professor here at Strathmore Business School. And she's originally from AABS Business School, which is one of our main global partners here. And she's a professor of strategic management and also academic director of the Center for Globalization and Strategy at AABS Business School. She's published widely and teaches competitive strategy, corporate strategy, and strategic alliance management, both in the MBA and also in the PhD program. Her presentation is going to be on the Africa Initiative at AABS Business School. Professor Arinyo, most welcome.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here this evening and honored by having been asked to join a group of such distinguished speakers. I know we are running late of time, but let me just take 1 minute to clear a question that you may have in mind. It's, how did this lady get such a name, right? So I was born in a city that belongs to Spain, but it's located in the northern part of Africa, next to Morocco. And in fact, my full name is Maria Africa, after Our Lady of Africa, and that's quite a common name in that city. So now that you know, we can proceed on the presentation on the role of business schools in, I would say, writing Africa's economic story. And I think we are all convinced that we are playing a major critical role in this. Now, I'm not going to spend much time. We all are aware that in order to have that social and economic development, there are many factors that need to be working towards that goal. And among them, a very important one is to have well-managed companies, both economically and socially. We cannot dissociate the social development from the economic development. And for that, we need to have well-trained managers, for which we need business schools with high-quality programs, and for that we need a highly efficient and proficient faculty that do a great job both at teaching and at research. So, I'm sure you have seen these numbers before on the need to train about 1 million managers in Africa, to go just in the low end of it. And according to that, the same source, which is the African Management Initiative, there are 90, this may be a bit outdated, a couple of years ago or so, 90 business schools in Africa, out of which less than 10, according to them, meet international standards, and about 40 are of reasonable quality. I don't have information about doctoral programs in Africa, neither about people who are being trained somewhere else. So, how is AABS contributing to writing Africa's economic story? Let me touch upon, well, you will probably know how we have contributed to create the Lagos Business School, MDE in Ivory Coast, with the contribution from Lagos, from LBS, Strathmore, ASM, in Angola, and we have had also some relationship with Nile University. However, nowadays that had to be discontinued because of the situation. So let me touch upon those 3 areas about faculty, the business schools themselves, and direct training to business leaders. What do we do? One important means to contribute developing faculty capacity is through our International Faculty Program. This is a program where faculty from all over the world, among them from Africa, come to ESF for a month, and they receive training on areas such as curriculum development, course syllabus development, case writing, effective teaching techniques, research design, and so on and so forth. So far, there have been 61 participants from Africa, 26 of them from our associated schools, but about 35 from other schools. And I strongly encourage you to consider this program as an additional formation training for your own faculty. And let's see now, the moment of truth comes, whether the video is going to work or not. I wanted to show you a video of last year's president, class president, who happens to be a person from Strathmore Business School.
This is an extremely interesting program for development of faculty, international faculty. And in the 2013 IFP program, we were people from 16 countries, we were 31 in total, and we spent 3 weeks during which we really became friends, thanks to a very intense program, very intense work schedule, in which we have preparation at 3 levels. There's individual preparation, we've got group preparation, and the general session preparation. We were taken through the general sessions by very experienced faculty. The consensus by all the people to part the program is that really this is something that is, is a watershed activity. It marks a before and after the participation in the program. A number of initiatives have already begun thanks to the encounter in the program. We already have a book writing activity, various people writing chapters. Then there is an activity to ensure that we remain in contact. So using the advancements in technology, we're working on initiatives to ensure that we all collectively assist in development of faculty worldwide. And there's also an intention to have every year a meeting. And in 2014, we're planning to have the first meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, at the Strathmore Business School. This is really a wonderful experience, which shows that the barriers that may appear to exist between people, really come down when people sincerely work together, as we did during the IFP 2013.
Another means to contribute to capacity building is through our PhD program. So far, we have had 4 participants from Africa, both in the PhD and the earliest stage of which covers the course part of the PhD program, the Master of Research in Management, 3 from LBS and 1 from SBS. We also have welcomed as visiting students some of LBS's own PhD students who come for maybe a quarter or a semester to take courses with us. We, the faculty at ESM, get involved occasionally on the dissertation committees of some of the students of LBS as well. And right now, for instance, I'm working with Professor Mungai here at SBS to try to design and develop a new PhD program that they are planning to launch a few years down the road. Let me show to you another testimonial of Professor Tunji Abejesan at Lagos Business School, who did his PhD with us.
PhD here at ESA for me was a life-changing experience. I think it converted me from, I was an engineer, converted me into a business academic. And I said in the preface of my dissertation that if I had to do 1,000 dissertations, I'd do all of them here at ESA. So yeah, it was a great experience. I learned about research, I learned about people, and above all, I learned about the role of firms in society and how, as academics, we have a duty to society, to firms, to the people who manage those firms, to help them find solutions to the problems they encounter every day. So I think it was a life-changing experience, and it really prepared me to play the role I play right now. So I'm actively involved in the profession and in management and in leading. I think there are some things that are more noticeable and some things that are less noticeable, but maybe more important. So more noticeable is the emphasis we put on human beings and on ethics. So that comes across in everything. The approach in the essay is that not everything, so not the end doesn't justify the means. So we have courses on anthropology, on ethics, and we study those things quite a lot, and that is really important. It comes across you in everything. But what I really appreciated most was the human touch, the way they treat you as a human being, the wonderful relationship between the professors, the students, and with the rest of the ESA community. I was about to say family.
As a consequence of them being through our PhD program, and also not only because of that, also on other occasions through our informal relations between faculty from one and other institutions, of course there are opportunities for doing joint research, and some of this research is getting published in very good journals, such as the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal, for instance, to give you an example of a collaboration between currently Professor Uchenna Uzo at AABS and our former faculty member Johanna Meyer, who left the school 1 year ago or so. So really the faculty gained this ability of doing research which is at comparable levels with any top university. How do we contribute directly to the business schools, the running of and management of the business schools? And now this seems to have got stuck. Okay. Can you pass on to the next overhead? In the meanwhile, I will just tell you that ESA, for instance, has a joint committee with LBS, whereby important decisions about the future of the school are taken. Also, some of our faculty sit on SBS advisory board, along with Professor Ryan. I believe he's also in the advisory board of SBS. And there are opportunities for administrators of the business of the associated business schools to come and visit ESA, interact with our own administrators and managers of executive education programs, of the different divisions of the school, of the different facilities, and so on, and gain experience. Finally, we also contribute by directly training business leaders in Africa. For instance, through the Pan-African AMP and Pan-African Executive MBA Week in Barcelona, whereby people from both of these two schools spend 1 week. They have the opportunity not only to network among themselves, but also with business people from not only Spain either, but from all over the world, as they come and there are people from all over the world joining those networking events. We have also contributed to the launch of top management programs in Ivory Coast, along with our colleagues from LBS, and with ASM, which is a school in Portugal. We have done the same in Angola. And occasionally, our faculty also comes and teach at the different African schools. But I would say that this becomes a virtuous cycle that reinforces itself, because to the extent that there are well-trained business leaders, that poses a challenge to faculty to become better and better, because, you know, when you are facing top business leaders, you just have to be on top of your research and on top of your teaching. So that, again, reinforces the cycle. Moving forward, ESA created a few years ago what we call the Africa Initiative, which is broader. And the goals of this initiative are not only to cooperate with the associated business schools, but also to contribute developing new projects, new programs, and hopefully new business schools throughout Africa. And also to promote the active involvement of more companies in Africa. So for instance, when the AMP, Pan-African AMP program comes to ESA for 1 week, there is an event organized there on business opportunities in Africa, so that the African participants have an opportunity to say, okay, I'm in this industry, I work in that industry, and Spanish business people gather with them and discuss opportunities of doing business together. We also support social initiatives for Africa through fundraising, occasional fundraising for initiatives such as Kimilea here in Kenya or the Enugu Hospital in Nigeria. And also our MBA students are very active involved in that. And this initiative has been recognized as one of the brightest ideas by one of the business magazines in Spain. But it would not be fair, as I said, to finish here, because the African schools have also and do contribute a lot to the development of ESM. How so? Well, when we talked about research collaborations, this is two-way. It's not only ESA faculty contributing to the development of African faculty, but it's also that they have the opportunity to gain access to these research collaborations. There are also case writing opportunities, and by the way, I didn't put it, but again, this works both ways. It's very beneficial for us to have the opportunity to come here and get to understand in depth a company and write a case. We can also use this as a way to develop capacity here in case writing. And another way in which the African schools are contributing, in particular Strathmore, is through a module for our MBA course on doing business in Africa. There is no way we could have done that without the support and the contributions from a Strathmore Business School, who have put together a wonderful program and have actively contributed to delivering that course for our MBA students. And finally, by providing opportunities for ESS faculty on development. Sorry, I put my own picture there, but that's what I had handy. To me, it's a luxury to have to be hosted by a Strathmore Business School for 3 months, and prior to that, I spent 3 other months at Lagos Business School on my sabbatical, because clearly Africa is going to write the story of the business world, not only the business world, but the world, if we do what we have to do here in our business schools. So ESA prides itself with its global character, focus on people, our general management perspective, the relevance and rigor that we try to instill in our faculty, and the transformational impact that we have. But I have to say again that our associated African schools play a very important role in us keeping up these characteristics, and are contributing actively to our own mission, which is to develop leaders who can have a positive, deep, and lasting impact on people, firms, and society through professionalism, integrity, and a spirit of service. So you can see our mission is very aligned with what Africa needs. So there is clearly a mutual benefit there. And I just wanted to finish by encouraging you to take a look at the blog called ESA and Africa, where we speak a little bit about the Africa Initiative. And also, if you want to take a look at the blog I initiated while I was at Lagos on my own perspectives about Africa, I would love you to contribute to the blog. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arino, presentation, as well as for sharing with us the testimonies of the participants of the programs in ESA and all the initiatives that are happening in Africa. We would like to recover some of the time that we have lost during the session this afternoon, and so we have a few proposals on how to make that happen. We were to have the discussions in the breakout rooms for three of the speakers. Now that discussion was supposed to be 45 minutes. We'd like to cap it at half an hour, that is 30 minutes at the most. And there will be 3 rooms to be used for these discussions. The first discussion shall be led by Dr. Robert Mudida at the AMP room. The AMP room is outside to the left, the immediate left. That's a AMP room for a discussion with Dr. Mudida. Then there shall be another discussion led by Professor Ryan, which shall be the Co-op Bank room. The Co-op room is right out to the right. And then the third discussion shall be led by Professor Robin Kibuka in the Tanzanite room. Now the Tanzanite room is on the lower ground floor. And so to get there, you'd have to go the stairs, take the stairs, and then get down. To the left, turn right, then turn left. We have some ushers there. So this discussion that you will have, you would also need to have the head of the discussion, that is Dr. Mudida, Professor Ryan, and Professor Kibuka, coming back here to give a 5-minute wrap-up, 5 minutes at most for each of them, because we want to leave here by 7 to go back to the hotel. And as you go out, I would like to talk to the French-speaking delegates who are in the conference. We realize that our translator does not feel that he's having a conversation. So for the French-speaking delegates, maybe we could meet us outside just to help us understand how we can work together. Because at the moment, since his services are not being used, we may need to know whether to continue with him tomorrow. And then one more thing, we have the conference bags for you. The speakers are requested to please take their conference bags from the table that they registered when coming in. It's a very beautiful bag, I assure you. And Also, the delegates, when you came in as you registered, please go to the registration desk when going out to pick the bag. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you, I welcome you to go for the discussion sessions. Dr. Mdida in the AMP room out to the left, Professor Ryan, the Corp Bank room outside the room that is to the right, Professor Kibuka, Tanzanite room, that is, you go down the stairs, then turn right, and then left. Thank you.